is Ticky Fullerton on Your Money.
Hello there, I'm Ticky Fullerton, every night bringing you a full hour, the very best in business coverage across the nation and internationally, especially where business and politics meet, and they have again today. Coming up, I couldn't have done it as a public company. Toll Chief Executive Michael Byrne talks about the business's turnaround under Japanese ownership and where the growth and the cuts will come from to deliver positive cash flow by the early 2020s. NEG 2.0, Labour's energy election pitch to accelerate renewables. Will it work or will it threaten reliable power? And what will it do to electricity prices? Coming up with EY's Matt Rennie, and just what to make of the financial planners, the front line with the customer in delivering financial advice, and of their representative bodies, which need to play a big role in curbing misconduct in the industry. We'll hear from the Financial Planning Association's CEO, Dante Gori. Well, opposition leader Bill Shorten has announced a future Labour government would subsidise batteries for 100,000 homes under a plan to reach its 50% renewable energy target by 2030. $200 million will be provided for $2,000 subsidies for homes with solar panels. The programme will be means tested only for homes with a total income of up to $180,000. Coalition's now abandoned National Energy Guarantee will be adopted in some form that ensures there will be enough baseload power while lowering emissions. Details are still to come on subsidies for more renewable energy power projects to replace coal as it exits the system. Well, what indeed to make of this energy plan, and how does it stack up against what the government is offering? For more, I'm very pleased to welcome Matt Rennie, Power and Utilities Leader from Ernst & Young, and I've got him in the studio this time. It's nice to talk to you.
Thanks, Ticky. Nice to be here.
So we knew that something like this was going to come from Labour. Quite a lot of subsidies, you've got to say, which is again pushing this idea of renewables going off-grid.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting and very hard to compare with the original NEG, which of course was more focused on generation than it was the later parts of the supply chain.
Okay.
But it's a very interesting policy, this one. It's a more thoughtful policy than the NEG.
Yeah, what do you make of it? What do you make of it?
Well, on the generation side, I'm not really in favour of subsidies or distortions to the market, and it does that. The good thing about the NEG was that it centred on reliability, and then it let the market figure out the lowest way of getting it there.
So by distortion, do you mean the actual government subsidies that are going in, or do you mean the renewable energy target? Yeah,
well, actually both. So right. The subsidy in the form of the target will mean that that more investment goes towards renewables than perhaps might be necessary. I think renewables have really passed the point where any subsidy is required. So calling out a target, I think is probably unnecessary. And it was one of the good things about the original NEG was that they didn't do that, and they sort of let the market figure out what generation was best.
OK. Going back to this off-grid stuff, we've also got, of course, Daniel Andrews, the Andrews government, I think, spending, what, 1.2 or 4 billion on similar sorts of solar subsidies. Now we've got this one on the federal basis. What happens to the stability of the grid? Because I can remember the Energy Security Board, Kerry Schott, a month ago or so, talking about it as being anarchy.
Well, the thing about renewable energy is there's probably not enough of it at the moment. So there's about 6 gigawatts of renewable energy in the system of a total 50 gigawatts. There's not really a call for much more coal-fired power in the next 20 years. We think probably about 6 gigawatts will come off the system in retirements in the next 15 years.
Yes.
That'll almost certainly be met by the 20 gigawatt pipeline of solar and wind that's already out there.
So if you are pushing through your higher energy target, renewables, more renewables into the grid, what about the threat that this will prematurely push out coal-fired or indeed other dispatchable power, because it will effectively hollow out the business model of the coal-fired power station?
I think that's a real threat. If we look at what's happened in Germany, for example, Germany's a 90 gigawatt demand system which has 90 gigawatts of renewables installed and 90 gigawatts of conventional energy. And that's probably removed about 200 billion euros in the balance sheets of the conventional companies. So it is a real threat.
Because they've had to double up.
Absolutely, that's right, yeah, absolutely. But the interesting thing about what this policy does, what Labor's policy does, is I think it deliberately skews towards renewables at a time where I think it'll probably already happen. But having said that, we think it can go from about 6 gigawatts to probably 20 gigawatts in the next 15 years safely anyway.
One of the things that the Labor policy does do, though, by means testing this, and again the same is true for the Daniels state government, is that so far this putting solar, it requires capital up front, and it means that those who have actually spent the money to go off-grid now have cheaper electricity bills. So it was leading to sort of inequality there. So at least it does kind of address that. Do you think that's what's behind some of this? Yeah,
I mean, so I have to say I'm generally in favour of the market against subsidy, but on this particular case, on the batteries, I think the direction is right, but funnily enough, the amount of the subsidy is too low. And I'll explain why. There is we are in the middle of probably the greatest transformation in the grid since 1880.
Yes.
And in the future, once we can put IoT, artificial intelligence, machine learning into the grid, we can start to move load around more effectively. And
demand manage more, presumably.
Absolutely, and batteries are a fundamental part of that. So getting 1 million batteries out there is great. The problem is that to put a battery on a house is about $8,000. And for people that earn less than $180,000 a year,
so
a $2,000 subsidy, I have to query whether it's actually going to push more out there. But I think the direction is right. It's probably one of these cases where a little bit of intervention is probably okay because there is a bit of market failure around this at the moment. So
how do you think this is going to fly? I mean, just say there is a Labor government. I suppose it depends on the votes, but they're saying that this is now almost, it should be bipartisan, should be quite easy to get bipartisan support because it was Malcolm Turnbull's idea after all. Do you think it's likely to fly politically?
Well, I mean, on the politics, I'm sort of less qualified to comment, but on the power system economics, I think it makes sense to push a bit of incentives towards the battery and solar piece. We forecast, so our research is that by 2021, the cost of batteries and solar will be roughly equivalent to the grid. So we think there'll be an S-curve of adoption after that. A $2,000 subsidy, if it is taken up, if it is significantly taken up, we'll push that forward. I think it'd be good for the system. So from that perspective, it's probably positive.
Transition is the all-important thing, right? The smooth transition. Josh Frydenberg, when he was Energy Minister, was talking about the trilemma. Now as Treasurer, he's really reduced it to a dilemma, and they've ditched the emissions side of it. But in this transition, the Labor proposal, what will that do to energy prices? So on the transition piece, I think this policy is probably more thoughtful around the transition piece than the neg was because it's broader, because it considers the needs of transmission and the new architecture, the needs for distribution and also for the customer around the battery and solar. In terms of the pricing, I think it's going to be difficult for some of these things to bring prices down, but over the next 10 to 20 years, we will need to transition to a new system, and that is going to cost money. So really, in order to keep prices down, there is that ever threat of price capping on the retail price front. Well,
I think there's always that risk because you need to protect the consumer at the same time. What we've found is that even in the United Kingdom, where there's a lot of retail competition and they've had it for 20 years, only 20% of the people there have actually changed retailer. So they've got similar sort of issues to what we've got around the standard offer and the market offer contracts.
What about the dispatchability side, and what do you think this Labor proposal will do for risks of blackouts and brownouts in transition?
Well, I think the risk of the blackouts was always tempered by the fact that the market is instantly ready to respond. Part of the difficulty I think we were always going to have is as we became more renewables based, we would need more firming capacity, either hydro or gas. And with the gas moratoria, that was going to be complicated. And so we do need some incentives towards firming, but the market's ready. And there are
But do you get the impression that Labor is also looking at the sort of things that Angus Taylor's looking up in terms of firming up and underwriting?
I think so. I mean, under the generation piece, it looks like there's a similar sort of program, but a skew towards firming and renewables. I guess from my perspective, I agree with the skewing towards the firming, less so with the renewables. I think we're probably already there in terms of the market providing that outcome.
Matt, Rennie, so good to get your views. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thanks very much.
OK, well, today is a Thanksgiving Wednesday in the United States, traditionally the busiest driving day in America ahead of the big family gathering. At the American Chamber of Commerce lunch in Sydney today, Michael Byrne, CEO of global freight and logistics giant Toll Group, was speaking about, among other things, the growth opportunities he saw with some of the big US customers. Michael Byrne is driving a major turnaround of the toll business after it was bought by Japan Post, which then found itself writing off a cool $5 billion billion as a result of, well, really an expansionist strategy under the previous management. It's been a tough year as a result, 2017, but the business in 2018 is starting to shape up. From a truckie at just 14 years old to running the multinational, Michael Byrne himself has been on quite a journey. He is part of our chat at AmJam. You call yourself a disruptor, Michael. It has been a phenomenal turnaround. What sort of conversations did you have with your Japanese owners about it?
Look, it was... It is true what was said in the media when I was asked by Nagato-san. Nagato-san, who runs a $141 billion business and has 400,000 people. I went to a discussion with him, and it's very predictable, regimented, structured, and he just said, Michael, fix it and hurry. And that was the only instruction I was given.
And it was quite personal in terms of, I mean, they just had the big nuclear disaster, hadn't they?
So Fukushima, which we talked a lot about last year, when Japan Post was being listed, if people understand, and it's been sold down now to about 58%. It's to fund Fukushima, which is like $100 billion to remediate the soil. And there's still around 70,000 people, I think, who are living in tents and 7 years on from that disaster. So it's being sold down, and 13% lots at $20 billion a time. It makes it one of the largest IPOs every time they sell 13% to help fund Fukushima. So it is very personal to the Japanese on why Toll has to be a success to drive their share price, because they see it as a great moral obligation to remediate Fukushima and the surrounds. So
your transformation, as you said, a $5 billion write-off it was, I think, of one way or another last year. Now you're turning it around, you've still got to lay off people, and you're saying largely accountants.
Largely accountants, so I'm not letting any of my three children, they're becoming scientists or mathematicians, which is another great concern of mine, how maths isn't standard for year 11 and 12 here in New South Wales.
But this is the disruption from, say, you said blame Oracle.
Blame Oracle. A lot of accounting and balance sheets and just doing journal entries and comparisons between debits and credits, that can all be done by an algorithm. So we can't afford that overhead cost. Customers won't pay for your back office. They want that to be streamlined. In Toll, we say standardise everything and turn it into sausages, everything that the customer can't see, or mince, and everything up front looks bright and shiny and is designed for the customer.
So this has, as I say, been a dramatic transformation. You, in a previous life, were running Linfox. You've run private companies, essentially.
Yeah.
How important, I mean, could you have done this transformation if Toll had been a publicly listed company?
Not possible. It just couldn't have happened. So I've worked for Sam Tarasco, one of Australia's richest men, Lindsay Fox, the Stokeses.
So what did it allow you to do, being away from the public eye, if you like?
Well, you don't stand in the shadows, but sometimes that's a good thing. Like these are really tough things to fix. These are really tough things to do. Again, shareholders want quarterly updates or quarterly returns. They're not going to allow me to spend. We're spending $1.6 billion since I started to fix core fundamentals in the business. Public companies aren't going to allow that.
What about your relationship with the unions?
Well, we had a lot of... Look, I came to Toll for a couple of things. My specialties, bad safety, really bad safety issues. So I was trained a particular way by May Nicholas. So I had 11 years at Mains. And then bad IR, and then numbers. IR, I believe in freedom of association, so I'm not ideologically anywhere here. I believe that men and women should have a choice to do whatever they like. The TWU last year, we had massive issues, particularly with the Teamsters and Jimmy Hoffa Jr.
Yep.
And I was in North America again about that. We spent $7 million on one legal fight on the port of Los Angeles. We just can't afford those things. They don't add any value.
So what do you think of the sort of now pressure for industry-wide bargaining here in this country with wages growth so low?
So we've had 27, 28, 29 years of economic growth.
Indeed.
We haven't had 2 quarters of negative growth, the definition of a recession, or 3. Why are we thinking about breaking something that is the envy of the world? Well, it doesn't make any intellectual sense. We are 1, 2, 3 richest people in the world. Per capita income, life expectancy, health care, and we're thinking of blowing that up for some ideological reason. The unions, I'm very close to the TWU. I spoke to Tony Sheldon today, who's moving into the Senate, and I knew Steve Hutchins very well, God rest his soul, and John McLean. We're not always on the same side. I've had some terrible fights with them, but in the end they've been pragmatic businessmen, and they need to stay the same. We don't need to be ideologically pigeonholed into having a confrontation that only hurts the workers anyway.
You yourself started as a truck driver at what, 14?
12. My mother, I'm the oldest son. My mother owned a trucking company. She trained me. I think it was highly illegal. She's 79 now. I still think she should be charged for making me do that.
But you say, I mean, here we are, we're talking really global now. You say education is so important. I mean, we've got the Victorian election round the corner this weekend. It looks like Daniel Andrews will get back in largely on this boon in infrastructure spending.
Well, who drove into the city today? How long did it take you? Like, the amenity of life. Why people are so angry is the amenity of life is changing so much because we're not spending on architecture and infrastructure, and we focus too much, in my view, on hard infrastructure. I'm as interested in soft infrastructure. Cindy, the amazing Cindy, who's my EA, and I told you this story outside. She came up in a very different schooling system in Taiwan. She's 6'1". So she's very different and difficult Taiwanese lady who looks after me. Speaks, writes and does mathematics fluently in English, Japanese, Cantonese, Mandarin and a bit of Thai. She came out of a different schooling system. We have a schooling system here which only 5-6 years ago, there was more people learning Latin than there was Mandarin. Why? We're not all going to be Jesuit priests. Yeah. Why aren't we dealing with our largest trading partner? Why aren't we teaching mathematics to year 11 and 12 students? They can drop out. We have basically no language skills. We're 25 million people at the bottom of the world whose all its trade is with China, Japan, South Korea, Southeast Asia and India. And we hardly teach any languages and we don't teach mathematics. It is not, we are destining our children to be poor.
So you are looking for staff now and drivers. You've said there's a shortage of drivers both in this country and in the US.
And Japan and most countries around the world and Germany.
Yeah. Okay, the salaries are significantly higher than, you know, other average salaries. Do you need 3 languages to drive a truck though? I mean, the sort of people that, the drivers of tomorrow, will they need to be tech savvy or just do they need to know how to drive?
Well, I think there's 2. I think you're going to see a wiping out of the middle, unfortunately. So you're still going to need truck drivers and autonomous driving and all those things that everyone's really excited about. 2030, 2035 maybe. Electrification, that's all reasonable nonsense in my view, because a truck weighs 1.8 tonne more as a electric truck than a diesel truck, and you get 160 kilometres out of it and it costs 3 times as much money. So unless the customers are going to pay for that, put your hand up. That isn't going to happen. So I think we're going to see a holing out of it. We're still going to need truck drivers. We're going to see a holing out of the accountants, those people in the middle, and then the people at the top end have to be more global in their thinking, better educated, probably multicultural and multi-language to be able to interact with the people who are making decisions. I think I said to you, I went to a meeting for Colgate. They're a large customer of
This
ours.
was in New York?
It was in New York. It's not a joke. A Venezuelan, 2 Japanese, a Pommy, and 2 Australians talked about for an hour and a half our business in Chengdu, Shanghai, Guangzhou. We don't do any work for them in Australia, a little bit, and nothing in North America. Went to a meeting for Abbott Technologies. It was in Chicago. A Costa Rican, an Ecuadorian, a Japanese, a Pommy and an Australian talked about moving air freight for drugs from Amsterdam into Beijing. That meeting was done in 3 languages.
So do you think we get it in Australia?
Absolutely not. We just don't get how quickly the world is changing. Apart from Woolies, Coles, FMG, not even Rio's run out of Singapore for us, BHP, a few others, some of the big global decisions are never made here.
Very interesting fellow. After the break, talking the failings of financial planners with the Financial Planning Association CEO, Dante Gori.
You're watching Ticky on Your Money. Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Well, the Royal Commission has not minced words in regards to the financial planning industry. Misconduct within the industry has led to the closure of Dover Financial, public humiliation of a few public figures, and mass firings of financial planners within our Big Four banks. So, what to say about our financial planning bodies that are responsible for preventing industry-wide misconduct? The Financial Planning Association CEO Dante Gori was at today's 2018 Professionals Congress at the Sydney International Convention Centre. He spoke about the need for client-focused financial planning and a new shake-up to standards for financial planners. The FPA made news actually in The Australian this morning with a report it banned critic Dr. Adrian Raftery from attending the national conference. Well, for a little more on all of the above, I sat down with the FPA's Dante Gori a little earlier. Dante Gori, thanks for talking to me. What's the mood out here among financial planners?
Well, the mood at our Professionals Congress is quite good actually, very positive and upbeat, and it's a great opportunity for a lot of financial planners to get together at the end of a tough year to discuss, learn and educate themselves on what's ahead.
Well, I was going to say, you could ask, why would anyone go into financial planning after the Royal Commission?
Well, financial planning is in high demand. Clients, Australians need advice, and I think the last research report I've seen for Investment Trends indicated that 3 million Australians have an unmet advice need. We've got an ageing population, so the demand for advice is really big still, and the financial planners that are in practice at the moment know that they're doing a great job and are providing a valuable service to their clients.
Well, not all of them, it would appear, have been doing a great job. How do you think the Hayne final report will impact financial planning?
Well, the majority are doing a fantastic job, and of course there's always going to be individuals that don't, and in any profession that will occur, and there isn't a magic bullet that's going to stop people doing the wrong thing. But of course we need to work better in preventing and ensuring that there are better standards and ensure that less of these issues do occur. So change will often occur, change will occur post the Royal Commission, but it's important to note that change is actually already happening. Already now we have legislation in place and we're implementing reforms to improve the education standards, for example, for financial planners. At the Congress here we had the CEO of the Financial Advisor Standards and Ethics Authority.
This is FASIA.
FASIA, Stephen Glenfield, speak to our members. And so there are a raft of policy documents and standards that are being finalised as we speak. That is already in train and will happen starting from next year.
So what has the head of FASIA said at the conference about how they're going, what the education standards are, what the monitoring will be, where are they?
Yes, well this week in fact they've rolled out a number of legislative instruments for consultation. Not all of them have been released. He informed us today that I think 4 of the 6 of those legislative instruments have now been released for consultation. He mentioned that he's still hopeful that those standards will be finalised by the end of the year. It's a big work program, and for us and for the profession, it's really about the clarity. I mean, there's so much uncertainty that's occurred.
Well, that's been one of the criticisms, actually, that FASIA's been roundly criticised for changes that might drive financial planners out of the market, and particularly financial planners who've been in there for some time and got experience. Now, you support FASIA. Why?
We support the raising of education standards. I mean, so the policy and the standard of around education is really, really important. I mean, I think you need to remember here, we're going from a current standard that the regulator's in place, which is known in the industry as RG 146, but effectively it's a diploma level standard. The FPA has been championing the fact that if you are going to provide personal financial advice to everyday Australians, you need to be appropriately qualified. And for us, that's a degree standard. So that's very, very important here. It's about we are supporting the need to lift the standards in terms of how to enter the profession.
Even if it means that it's going to be more difficult for some financial planners to actually stay in the industry.
Well, the challenge for the body in terms of how they do this is that you've got a standard that you're going to be imposed going forward, but you also need to transition a whole industry to the new standard, and this is where the debate is. And what do you factor into that transition? Experience, obviously, in itself is very, very important, but it's not something that you can have a piece of paper on to demonstrate it as a qualification, which gets to the technical issue around experience versus qualification.
Well, FASIA has been criticised, as I say, especially by AIOFP. Now, why did you feel it was necessary to actually ban or disinvite Dr. Adrian Raftery from the conference?
So Dr. Raftery has been asked not to attend the conference as the role that he plays as the chairperson of another association, as a result of the comments and that other association has provided over probably the course of the 6 to 12 months.
But it's criticised FASIA.
So to be very, very clear, this is commentary that the association has made about commentary made about the FPA as well as the profession, which has been complete slander and obviously not correct. So this is commentary which may not necessarily have been a witness to everybody, but this is commentary they've made that we're aware of, that again is not appropriate commentary.
But is this commentary around sort of potential conflict of interest that FPA might have in that you'd be looking at having a part in FASIA's education materials? You are going to be part of
I'm sorry, you're completely going down the wrong track here. There are commentary made about the FPA which is completely incorrect and defamatory. I'm not going to go into what the commentary is about.
So not the sort of comments that I'm asking you about?
No, not at all.
So what do you think of those comments, that the FPA might be looking for a major role in terms of monitoring?
The only role the FPA has and is looking for is to raise the standards of education and to make sure that we have a profession going forward. That's the only role of the FPA, and we are advocating on.
So the suggestion is that you're supporting FASIA because of the role that you...
So, Ticky, again, we're not supporting FASIA, we're supporting the standards, okay? So FASIA is a government agency that's been set up to implement the standard. Yeah. We're supporting the standard, and we've been providing consultation feedback on the standard itself, that across a number of things, not just education, CPD, code of ethics. There's a whole range of standards that are being implemented by the new body, and the FPA supports the need to raise those standards. We've actually been quite critical in some of the previous proposals that have come out for consultation, and we've gone back with feedback and we've pushed quite hard to get those changes made.
So the FPA represents the whole profession, but an important part of your membership is those financial planners who are aligned to or licensed by the banks.
And that's not correct either. So we have 14,000 members, and our members are licensed across every business model in the country. So our members, yes, are licensed through some of the institutions. Our members hold their own licence. A lot of our members also are licensed through industry super funds.
Vertical integration is defensible.
Well, vertical integration itself, that's different to the way advisors are paid. I think there are challenges with vertical integration, absolutely. And what you're finding is already the market responding to that. So the banks are getting out of the advice business. But there are vertical integration throughout the whole profession. So it's not just at the bank level. It has its challenges, and whether it can exist going forward, well, that's the question for the Commission.
Dante, Gori, thank you so much for joining me.
No, you're welcome. Thank you.
Well, switching to politics now, and the Victorian Treasurer has announced the state will double its debt to 12% of gross state product to borrow more than $26 billion over the next 10 years. Well, Sky News Melbourne Bureau Chief Aaron Young joins me now live. Aaron, this is quite a big borrow. What can you tell us about it?
Ordinarily, I tell you, it's a wonderful gift for the coalition, but with just 2 days to go, of course, until the state election, about 50% record numbers of people have already voted, would you believe? So comes as a surprise to many, but a bombshell from the State Treasurer today, hidden in that press release that we were given, was down towards the bottom, talking about how they would be stabilising our debt in Victoria to 12% of GSP, gross state product. So that doesn't sound like much when you say it, but 6% is what we're currently at, and that has continued to rise over the past 20 years. So the State's Treasurer, Tim Pallas, says it's incredibly important that we get into debt to pay for infrastructure. Here he is.
We have to borrow to build, because the cost of inaction will last for generations.
Interesting talking about inaction there, because Labor's been in power for 15 of the last 19 years here in Victoria, but debt's been a dirty word in this state since about 1992 when we kicked out the Kane-Kerner government. Jeff Kennett came in, didn't get into debt, but we certainly sold off and privatised a lot of assets. Labor came in, didn't like to use the word privatisation or debt, and we've been stuck in this conundrum with an increasing population. Now, we do know that when it comes to the Conservatives, then the coalition, they like to talk about debt and the concern for that for generations to come. It's not just us paying it. You don't usually hear it from Labor, let alone a Treasurer, just 2 days from a state election. But once again, here's a Treasurer talking about that.
It means we share the cost of the infrastructure across generations. We pay some, and our kids, who will be the principal beneficiaries of these investments, will also make a contribution to the projects that are so vitally important to the continued economic resurgence of this state.
So, Ticky, that's the state of things. We've heard from the opposition today saying that they won't be going into debt, but any more debt, I should say. We're already in a fair bit of debt as it is. But they will be looking towards privatising some of the Melbourne water assets, including a sewage treatment plant, leasing that back, which should be about $5 or $6 billion. I do love the idea of no new taxes that both sides keep talking about, but why do you need a tax when you have a toll? Today I was out with the Premier talking about $15 billion to be spent on the North-East link, not the East-West link, that's right, the North-East link. It will be tolled, so we won't be taxed for it, but it will go into debt and then we'll pay it off eventually through tolls.
Well, that's really interesting, and as you say, there's the Liberal government saying that they're going to privatise things. Asset recycling was really the only way, and the New South Wales government probably did it better than anyone else under Baird, but nobody has wanted to borrow. Really interesting, though, that this infrastructure push and jobs and those sorts of issues seem to be supporting Daniel Andrews, and the other issues like crime and violence, and you'd think that might float to the surface, don't seem to have in the same way.
It is interesting because the Victorian Coalition hasn't been talking about debt during this election campaign, even though it's slowly been rising and then quickly rising because of the huge infrastructure spend. But the Coalition have been focusing so much of this election campaign, all of their efforts, on crime. Now, crime is a big issue, certainly in Frankston, where we held the People's Forum last night. It really polls as the #1 issue down there. But when we talk about this idea of going into huge amounts of debt, on top of that $26 billion, which is on top of the debt that we already have just to pay the bills, there's also the concern that in 2050, Labor has announced that they'll be building a $50 billion suburban rail loop that goes and joins all of our suburban train lines, essentially. So where's that $50 billion going to come from? Because while they talk about things being fully funded, about $50 million for that has been funded only, and that's the planning for the next budget coming up next year should Labor win. So it does seem to be a mess. The truth is, Victoria, like New South Wales, has continued to grow, not just from immigration, but also Victoria seems to be the place that so many people from other states have been heading to over the past 10 years or so. This was an issue back in 2010 when the coalition came to power under Ted Baillieu. There were a lot of concerns leading up to then already about the lack of infrastructure spending that had been happening. As I say, we've been stuck not wanting to privatise anything, not wanting to go into debt. Nothing happened. All of a sudden, it's all happening at once. And you'd have to wonder, when you go out on the roads these days in Melbourne, it's very hard to get around because there's so much construction happening everywhere, whether it's tunnels or level crossing removals or bridges. We're all trying to play catch up, and you have to wonder, do people at the moment stuck in traffic thank the government for getting things done, or do they blame them?
Yeah, look, really interesting. Thank you so much for all that analysis, and I'm sure you've got a very busy weekend ahead. Thanks very much, Aaron.
Thanks, Tick.
Aaron Young there. OK. Now, after the break, the Royal Commission turns to ASIC. We'll get the latest from our Chief Business Reporter, Leo Shanahan, and the Australians Markets Reporter, Melissa Yeo, next.
This is Ticky on Your Money, covering the big business stories.
Well, welcome back. Moving to the Royal Commission now, and Westpac CEO Brian Hartzer has defended the bank's record on financial advice, which has been the subject of an ongoing remediation program through the corporate regulator ASIC. Under questioning from counsel assisting Michael Hodge QC, it was revealed that Mr Hartzer objected to being treated like the CBA. Also taking the stand today was Macquarie Bank's Nicholas Moore, who has contrasted his bank's approach to dealing regulatory problems after an ASIC intervention into its financial planning arm in 2013. And ASIC Commissioner James Shipton as well received the final questions of the day. Commissioner was quizzed on the nature of his relationship with the big bank bosses. On today's proceedings, I'm joined by Your Money's Chief Business Reporter, Leo Shanahan, and the Australians Market Reporter, Melissa Yeo. Now, look, Leo, let me come to you first. You're supposed to be up, you know, in the running for a Walkleys tonight. You couldn't get on the plane because of the wind.
I just love it here too much, Tick. Can't leave your side.
Good. Well, let's make use of you. Now, Mr Hartzer.
Yeah.
So he got through okay?
Well, I think so, comparatively, especially compared to the CBA the day and a half before.
And he didn't want to be compared to CBA.
No, and I think this was an interesting point. Not a lot, frankly, came out of this morning's discussion with Hartzer. It was more kind of grand themes around should banks be in financial planning, which I thought was an interesting discussion. His ultimate point being, yes, I think we can be, but it is difficult. You know, have they made it a hash of insurance? Yes. Once again, Westpac are interesting because unlike the others, they're not getting rid, holus bolus, of those parts of their business. But it was, I think, marginally entertaining at a time when it turned out when there was this APRA review into the banks generally, and Westpac had to basically engage in this process. Mr Hartzer objected to engaging in what he called a CBA-style review because we haven't been beset by their level of scandals. But look, have a listen to Hartzer from earlier this morning.
There's a section at the beginning which is observations from the prudential consultation.
Yes.
And the 5th bullet point down says, Brian thinks unfair everyone has to go through CBA exercise when nothing has gone wrong to CBA's scale.
Yes.
Was that a view that you expressed at that meeting?
I saw that. I don't recollect saying it quite like that. That doesn't sound like, I don't think I would have said it quite like that. My point was CBA had a series of massive public and customer issues that were well understood. Storm Financial, ComInsure, AusTrack. These had been very large, very significant things, and it'd been well reported that those hadn't been addressed very well. And my point was simply, we haven't had that. We have issues. We're dealing with them. And my concern was that the very extensive exercise that CBA was asked to undertake by APRA, which was very large and very comprehensive, it didn't seem obvious to me why we should have to do the same exercise. I wasn't resistant to us looking at the issues that came out of the report. In fact, I sent the report to our entire staff and said everyone should read this. That characterization is not, I don't think, a fair summary of how I thought about it.
Yeah, it was fairly robust there. Now, Melissa, interestingly, ASIC was also in the dock today, James Shipton, and that was Rowena Orr?
Yeah.
Cross-examining. Now, how did he go? Because, of course, at issue was the relationships between ASIC and the banks.
Exactly, and we kind of heard it with some of the what CBA's, you know, in the initial hearing this week, and they were saying that, you know, he was having meetings with Shipton and that sort of thing. So Rowena brought that up again and kind of was asking whether they're a bit too friendly, whether, you know, the banks are getting a bit too cosy with the regulator.
Really interesting, because James Shipton is relatively new. And you'd think almost he's sort of been pitching himself as something of a clean skin, but no, they were going him on his current relationship.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to say that they were calling often, that they were meeting often, but that there were no real minutes or records of what those conversations were. So there was questions of whether those meetings were really necessary, that if there were, you know, the right procedures and processes in place, that any breach reporting be reported through the proper regulatory channels instead of in a get-together. But I suppose Shipton was really really stressed the point that it was a professional meeting and that sort of thing, to try and really separate himself from any kind of friendliness perhaps that he might have with the banks.
So this wasn't like Catherine Livingstone getting sort of put over a barrel on lack of correct minute taking earlier this week, because that was sort of pushing it towards, I think Rowena Orr was suggesting that she might have breached the corporations or something. This was a slightly different lack of minute taking. It was the meetings, regulator meetings.
Yeah, that there were no minutes whatsoever, and there was the suggestion from Commissioner Hayne that they start, I mean, they said, he said that there were witnesses to these conversations, but he said that there would be, that obviously ASIC would consider taking minutes of these.
Did he sort of take offence at being told he was a bit cosy with the banks?
Oh, he definitely, and that's why I say he really defended that it was a professional relationship. At one point he says he made clear to specify that his meetings with Matt Common were meetings, that they weren't get-togethers, because of the insinuations of that kind of word as well. So he was quite, you know, quite stern, and I think the conversation did get a little heated as well. But that was, yeah, really the point of it.
Well, they're very good at insinuating these people. Now, Leo, of course, the other person in the box was Nicholas Moore at Macquarie Bank. Now, how was Macquarie Bank used by the Royal Commission?
It was pretty weird, I thought. They were basically held up as this standard of virtue, and I found that kind of weird. And I mean, the questioning was almost kind of obsequious in its tone. And it was like they brought him in and sat him down and said, well, you had these problems in 2012, 2013 with your financial planning arm. And he agreed and said, yes, we did. And ultimately, the business wasn't sophisticated enough and these guys were running wild. And we had a review into it. And ASIC pulled us up and they did their job. And it was all very, you know, it was all very kind of...
And then we dealt with it.
Yeah, it was all very backpatting, well, good work. And then we dealt with it. And then you know, some executives got bonuses cut and someone, you know, people lost their job. Basically, Hodge's point, Council Assisting Michael Hodge, was to use this as a kind of, as an example of when things work and what you can do as opposed to those retail banks. For those who cover finance, the idea that Macquarie is a clean skin is kind of hilarious. Yeah. But that being said, I see what he was doing, but the tone was kind of strange.
But it goes to the strategy, doesn't it? It goes to this sort of strategy, Melissa, that they kind of have their targets. You know, they've been sitting on all these documents, they know the direction that they're going, and it is a bit of a pantomime. I was thinking of the retail funds versus industry funds, and, you know, they obviously were gunning for the retail funds, didn't do very much on the industry funds. You know?
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see it play out so plainly. And he was in the chair for 60 minutes today. You know, they really got him in and got him out, and you know, it's completely opposite to what we've seen from the.
And ironically, this is in the context of discussing, pay scales and salaries for. I mean, this is the highest paid man in Australia, yes. let alone banks. I mean, it's 18.9 million. It was basically 19 million last year. Now, the point was they were making there's no problem with your pay structure if you can justify that, and you can, a lot of that's in shares, etc. But it was pretty odd in the context of a discussion around remuneration when you're talking about Macquarie, right?
But Melissa, he walked out of there pretty happy with himself.
Exactly.
It's almost skipping.
Exactly.
All right, well, that's very interesting. Yet another day, almost at the end of the week, the Royal Commission. Thanks, guys. Leo Shanahan and Melissa Yeo, thank you very much. After the break, yet another escalation in Myer versus Premier Investments and the stoush there. Remember, we interviewed Solly Lew yesterday. We'll get the latest with the Australian senior business reporter Eli Greenblatt next.
Now, back to Ticky.
Welcome back. Moving to markets now, and Myer has hit back at comments made by Premier Chairman Solomon Lew in the media last night. Myer says Premier is attempting to stage a hostile takeover and that investors should be deeply concerned. In a statement, Myer said, having expressly ruled out paying a premium to obtain control, the only way in which Premier may obtain control through Myer is through a board spill. Well, Mr. Lew also appeared on our show last night, revealing that he had indeed met with Myer CEO John King in a face-to-face meeting that lasted an hour and a half. Well, for more on this spectacular stoush, the Australian senior business reporter Eli Greenblatt joins me live from London. Eli, a few developments in the last 24 hours. So, what do we think of Solomon Lew's positioning?
First of all, to my family, don't be panicked. I'm not in London. I'm in Melbourne, but I'm here. Yes. But with Solly Lew, it's very interesting. What Myer have come out and said this afternoon is, from Solly Lew's comments to you last night, Ticky, and also on the ABC, Solly Lew was saying he's not making a takeover, he's not planning a takeover, he's not buying more shares. So Myer have jumped on this and said, aha, if he's not making a takeover, truth in takeover provisions mean that he can't then launch a takeover. So Myer are saying to its shareholders, be very careful. Solly Lew can't make a takeover now because he said publicly to you and to others that he's not making a bid. So therefore, the only way he can get control is via a board spill, putting his own directors on the board, but not paying a takeover premium. So he can't go down the takeover route. The only option to him, Solly Lew now, Myer is saying, is to grab control of the board, grab control of the company, but not pay a takeover premium. And Myer are warning its shareholders to be very wary of this.
Yeah, I mean, Solomon Lew has been pretty clear about it. He was clear on the ABC, he was clear on our show that no, he wasn't going to take over. You don't think a tactician like that would have thought through what his comments, what the implication of his comments?
Yeah, I mean, you would think he would, and you would think Solly Lew would have some of the best and smartest advisors in the room, just, beyond the camera advising him and helping out with his script. So I think, I don't think it's unlikely that someone like Solly Lew has snookered himself in this position. I think Myer are really trying to send a message to their own shareholders with this, that they're trying to perhaps rally their own shareholders as the vote, gets very close, it's on next week, to say to them, just look at what Solly Lew is saying, judge him by his own words, using that takeover provisions rules to remind them that he's not making a takeover, but he still wants control. So it's a takeover without paying for a takeover. So be careful.
What do you make of the meeting he told me about that he'd had with John King for an hour and a half?
Yeah. I'd love to know what was said. I'd love to be a fly on the wall in that meeting. I actually think there's quite a bit of respect between Solly Lew and John King. I think apparently John King and Solly Lew know similar people, kind of friends of friends and contacts of contacts. And I do think there's some kind of mutual respect there, and that Solly Lew sees in John King a true retailer who understands retail, who knows what to do at Myer. Of course, Solly Lew is also a very important customer of John King, in that Solly Lew's private companies, his family companies and Premier Investments together are the largest suppliers to John King outside of makeup and cosmetics. So there's some business to discuss there as well. Look, you know, I think they would have discussed strategy and the way the shops are looking, but I think the game Solly Lew is playing is that he's not having a go at John King publicly. He's really attacking the board and the directors, and of course, in particular, Gary Hounsell,
what do you think the chances?
John King alone.
What do you think the chances are of them getting the second strike on the remuneration report?
Well, I think you'd have to think it's a very good chance. He got the first strike last time, over 20-25%. So he got that first strike, and then you've got to ask yourself, have things gotten better or worse at Myer since that first strike? Well, you could say I think they've got a hell of a lot worse. The share price has fallen, sales have fallen, it's looking really bad. I mean, they've got John King in now, and John King, I think, is probably seeing it on the right path and doing the best he can. But I think you could say things have gotten worse, not better. So in that context, you think a second strike, you know, is certainly possible. And I think it's going to be very close. And I think Solly Lew's going to need all the support he can from the kind of average retail shareholder, probably thinking at this point that Anton Tagliaferro won't support Solly Lew in the second strike. Same for Jeff Wilson. They together account for about, I think, 15%.
Yep.
So Solly will need the other shareholders. I think it's possible he can do it.
Very briefly, Amazon, news on Amazon.
So Amazon have done a major U-turn, a major backflip on their decision earlier this year to block Australian shoppers from their overseas sites. Very quickly, as you may know, as you can remember, on July 1st, the federal government introduced this new GST tax on purchases below $1,000. Amazon came out and said, well, we can't comply with it, or we're unable to comply with that. So what we're going to do is block Australian shoppers or people with Australian mailing addresses from the overseas websites. You can only shop from the Amazon.com.au website.
And they've now opened it up
and
again.
a smaller global website. And now they're saying, oh, actually, we've listened to our customers after all the complaints, and we're going to now allow you once again to shop from online from overseas. Interestingly, just quickly, Ticky, when Amazon announced that, one of the biggest attacks on Amazon came from then Treasurer Scott Morrison, who absolutely savaged Amazon and Jeff Bezos personally when Amazon made that decision to block Aussie shoppers from the overseas websites. Amazon now backflipped, and now you can shop once again from the overseas Amazon websites.
Really interesting to see what that'll do to the market. Eli Greenblatt, thank you very much for that. And that's all for the show tonight. Tomorrow night, former Victorian Premier John Brumby just ahead of the Vic election. See you tomorrow at 5 p.m. on free-to-air Channel 95, or tonight on Catch Up at 8 p.m. on Foxtel's Channel 604. Thanks for your company.